Hello, UIPM athletes, and welcome to this episode of the UIPM Anti-Doping Podcast. Fortunately, I'm not here alone, and I'm here with my colleague Christian. Christian, welcome.
Hi, Tomasz.
Today, we will focus on two important topics that directly affect you as athletes. But before we start, this is the first episode of the season 2 of our podcast. So, what's new, Christian?
You know what? I've missed talking to our athletes, actually.
Me too.
It feels refreshing to be here again and to talk to our athletes and hopefully help them in their careers.
Yeah, and I also figure out that when we are preparing for our topics, we learn a lot as well. Because
Always something new. There's always something new.
and especially when you want to explain something, you really need to understand the topic properly.
Yeah, to get to the bottom of the problem.
So first, we will briefly explain the key changes in the 2026 Prohibited list. And
Have there been any major changes?
I wouldn't say that major changes, but we have one very important and interesting method. It's carbon monoxide inhalation. And you know that both of us were quite surprised that this method actually exists.
Yeah, we were.
And then we will focus on GLP-1 Receptor Agonist, aka Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro, and other brands.
Which is our favorite topic.
Of course, it's quite interesting in general. So when we start with Prohibited list, I think that first topic can be beta-2 agonist and especially salmeterol. And in this topic, what is interesting is that WADA is not only focused on substances themselves, but also on dosing intervals. So what's new with salmeterol?
You know what? So as we know, as our athletes probably know, you can take salmeterol in certain doses. You have maximum allowed delivered dose. Previously, it has been 200 micrograms per 24 hours. And what is new is that you shouldn't take it in one. You have to divide it, and you shouldn't take more than 100 micrograms per 8 hours.
Is it really that important to focus on that frequency and intervals? Does it really make that huge change?
You know what? It doesn't make that huge difference for the athletes, but for the anti-doping community and the regulators, it really does. So, for example, the athletes, if they are sick and they have asthma, they take salmeterol in 2 divided doses per day, and that's anywhere from 25 to 100 micrograms, which is in line with the new rules. So nothing changes if you are following the recommendations of your doctor, but something changes within the anti-doping community.
So, is it hard or is it difficult to figure out that salmeterol can actually improve or change performance? When is it like put it in once?
You know what? Not exactly with salmeterol, but in previous years, it has been found in other beta-2 agonists that if you take a lot of them in one, so in I don't know 4, 5, 6 inhalations, you actually can improve your performance when it comes to really intensive one. This is the case, for example, with formoterol, which has been there has been a change in the previous list, but yeah. So when you are taking these substances for the abuse of them, it has been we have come out with an idea that it is quite hard for us to distinguish between the allowed intake of salmeterol and between the prohibited intake of salmeterol. And this is based on the new study that has been published and that was founded by WADA.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. But what's good is that nothing has changed for our athletes if they follow.
Yeah, nothing has changed for the athletes. The change is mainly regarding catching the cheats. Well, because yes, as I have mentioned previously, it was hard to distinguish between if you could take, for example, 200 micrograms once a day or twice a day, which would be prohibited. There has been new data, so WADA has had to respond to that, and they've funded a meta-analysis. So they have looked at a lot of studies, selected 6 of them, and then fine-tuned the pharmacokinetics of salmeterol. And now the new rules should also catch the cheats.
So moving forward, we will stay in inhalation, but let's start talking about carbon monoxide, because both of us were quite surprised with this method. And from my perspective, I only knew that it's a toxic gas, which can not only harm you, but actually cause you death. So how this method can actually work to improve at least performance?
You know what? It still is a toxic gas, but yeah.
So nothing has changed.
Nothing has changed about that, but it could be used in 2 different ways, as a diagnostic tool and as well as non-diagnostic one to improve the performance. And what carbon monoxide does, it binds to hemoglobin within our red blood cells, and by doing so, the oxygen transporting capacity of your blood is reduced, and you are in a state of hypoxia. So if you take a lot of carbon monoxide frequently, you prolong the hypoxia state, and then your body has to respond to that, and that's by increasing erythropoiesis. So it has been found out that it could have performance enhancing effect because it induces your erythropoiesis within your body.
And why oxygen is no longer bound to hemoglobin?
You know what? The oxygen binds to hemoglobin, and that's the way how our body works, and that's the way how oxygen is transported in our bodies. And what carbon monoxide does, it also binds to hemoglobin with greater affinity than the oxygen, and especially the affinity is 240 times higher. So oxygen cannot bind there.
So as it is a toxic gas,
Mhm.
which is still true, only low level concentration of this gas can actually be inhaled, but there are still some risks. So what should our athletes be aware of?
You know what? If you inhale carbon monoxide in high doses, you could fall unconscious and probably die if the exposure is very high. So be aware of that. For example, when the carbon monoxide rebreathing is used for diagnostic purposes as a diagnostic tool, it is only used in small amount for a few minutes. Then your blood is taken, and yeah, as I've said, it is a diagnostic method. So what is the reason? The reason is that we want to know how much of hemoglobin we have in our bodies. For example, in sports science, sports scientists use this, for example, before the altitude training and after, and they compare and see how the training was efficient, and based on that, they can optimize the training.
I also see one problem that this method needs to be done repeatedly, so the accumulation effect can be very important. So that's the difference between diagnostic tool and this experimental idea to improve
Definitely.
performance.
For diagnostic purposes, you only take small bolus of carbon monoxide in a mixture of oxygen for a few minutes, and then you're done. You're done for several days or for several weeks or so. But then if you want to use it as a performance enhancing agent or method, you have to use it several times a day, frequent, every 4 or 5 hours, which was found in a Walter Schmidt study in 2020. It has been found that it could have similar effects to altitude training. So, for example, they have the athletes used carbon monoxide every 4 hours, so 5 times a day when they were awake, and after 3 weeks, the total hemoglobin mass increased by 5%, which is the same result that you would get after 3 weeks in altitude training.
To move to other substances, we also have some changes in the metabolic modulators and stimulants. And what is quite interesting is that we only have new examples of substances which have not been approved for human use. Nevertheless, they are presented in dietary supplements, especially in stimulants. Those substances are connected to modafinil and adrafinil, quite known stimulants, and some changes have been made to their molecular structure, I would say. One halogen was actually added. So, can you explain the purpose of this?
You know what? It has been done to improve its lipophilicity. That's how well they are dissolved in fats. So, for example, if you have higher lipophilicity of a certain substance, it goes through the body tissue more easily. And in the case of stimulants, it helps to go into the brain more quickly and have more prominent effect.
But we still don't know what side effects these molecules can cause.
We don't.
And that's the main risk of this substance, I would say.
Yeah, and yeah, these substances, these stimulants that are now prohibited or stated on the list, were found in dietary supplements. And as we always say to our athletes, do not take unsafe supplements, for example, pre-workout supplements, because those ones are high-risk supplements, and contamination with such substances is quite often seen.
And what would you recommend to our UIPM athletes, or what should they remember from the changes?
You know what? If you are taking some Metrol, just stick to the prescribed dosages, and then when it comes to carbon monoxide rebreathing, do not do it. It is prohibited. It is harmful. If you have to do it for diagnostic purposes, that is still allowed. You can do it as a diagnostic tool, but do not abuse it. And then when it comes to the stimulants, you know what? Do not take pre-workout supplements at all. I know that some of them are certified by NSF or other third-party companies, but you know what? Do not take them. You will be safe.
That sounds very promising. Now we can move from prohibited list actually to monitoring program, which is something invented by WADA just to monitor the prevalence of substances in athletes' samples. So they are monitored, but athletes are not sanctioned. And one substance, semaglutide, which is GLP-1 agonist, has already been added to the program. And for this year, tirzepatide, another GLP-1 agonist, was added as well. So that's the reason why we are focusing on this topic. So why athletes should be aware of these substances?
You know what is it is a huge trend in the general community to take these substances. They have been developed for obesity and other other problems that we could have with our health, but obesity is the most trendy one. But as you know, our athletes are not that obese, otherwise they wouldn't do this sport.
But still, we have some athletes who are actually watching their weight, I would say, or it's very important for their performance because they compete in weight category. So maybe these athletes would tend to use the substances.
You know what, you're right. In some certain situations, the athlete might count their body weight and their strength and so on, and there's the ratio in which the performance can be improved. However, if you are taking GLP agonists, the mechanism of action is that you are feeling full, you are satiated, and you do not consume enough calories to fuel your performance. So actually what can happen after several weeks or months, your performance might drop.
Yeah, because of the one thing is muscle loss, I would say,
Yeah.
and another thing, as you said, you don't have enough calories for your performance.
You have to feel your performance somehow, and our athletes know about that. I think that they spend a lot of time preparing their meals and doing everything they can to improve their recovery, and by using these GLP agonists, they might actually impair their recovery as well as performance.
And you know that we have really focused on biochemistry of GLP-1 agonists. We were so like thrilled to figure out the mechanism and how does it work. And just to sum up, I can say that the surprising fact is it's only about appetite suppression and basically reduce caloric intake. Isn't it like amazing?
It is. It actually is. So, for example, when you're diabetic, these GLP-1 agonists can help you to improve insulin production and also to better response to glucose in your blood. But if your main goal is to reduce weight and use these substances as weight loss agents, then the main uh, mechanism of action is actually GLP-1 agonism in your brain. And what it does is that it tricks you into being full all the time.
So you can be on calorie restriction, but
And
you
still,
you don't suffer.
you don't suffer that much.
That sounds very promising and very good, but we know there are some side effects which can be very, very serious, even though they are rare. We have some common side effects, so maybe start with those common ones.
You know what? A lot of people experience nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and these kind of gastrointestinal issues that might impair their performance when they're competing.
And what about those serious ones?
There are some serious ones. They're not that often seen. They're quite rare. So 1% of the patients that take these substances can actually damage their pancreas.
Which can be like life-threatening issue.
It really can, and it is an autoimmune response of your body. So it is not good if you develop such a disease because you don't know where it leads.
I have also heard about the gallbladder disease, which can be a huge problem. So it doesn't matter if you are elite athlete or just a recreational athlete or just a normal person, I would say. You really need to be very careful with these substances and always consult your doctor, right?
You know what you really do. So, for example, if you are obese or you're diabetic, you're taking these substances to help you with your disease, which is quite chronic one, and sometimes you do not have the willpower to overcome obesity. And these kind of substances can help you, but our athletes are not obese. I think so. And then there's not really a case for taking these substances because if you compare a patient that is ill, you have to compare the benefits and the risks of such substances. And the risk that we see to those gastrointestinal one, those are less important than the risks that obesity itself has. But if we have a healthy athlete, we are only looking at those side effects or those risks, and those are the ones that we should focus on. And if there are any, I wouldn't recommend it.
And maybe sometimes people believe that when they take Ozempic
Mhm.
or some other substance, it's only about that substance, but you need really change your diet, change your lifestyle, be very careful, for example, with water as well, because I've read that acute kidney injury can actually happen as a result of dehydration.
Mhm.
Quite interesting, right?
Interesting, right? You always have to put things into context. For example, these GLP-1 agonists and sporting performance. Yeah, you have athletes, those that train so hard. They are doing their best. They have multiple trainings, and you have to somehow fuel those trainings. And if you are not eating that much, that's not possible.
I think we really need to wait for body monitoring program results, especially on these two substances.
I'm very interested in that.
Yeah.
So, for example, in 2024, that was the first year that we have started looking into semaglutide. And as you see, this year, tirzepatide has been added. So there's
There's a reason.
there's focus. There's focus on this.
Yeah, because we believe that we are some kind of expert who can really understand something, but maybe when we see the results of the monitoring program, we're gonna be quite surprised.
Yeah. So, for example, in the past years with tramadol case, happened that the monitoring program revealed that tramadol was actually abused in some sports, and it has been prohibited. So, we'll see what happens in the future. Maybe GLP agonists will be prohibited as well, but GLP agonists will be prohibited as well. But we'll have to wait for that. But in the meantime, I like the approach of some international federations that warn the athletes about the side effects of GLP agonists, and that it is not quite ethical to use these substances to improve your performance, while on the other hand you have health effects and your sporting performance can decrease as well. So I like this approach of international federations, and I'm quite happy that we can discuss this on the podcast to share this message with our athletes as well.
I really like your message and idea that even though some substances are not prohibited, it doesn't mean they are safe for healthy athletes to improve their performance or just for managing their weight. So that's totally true. So we are coming to the end of our first episode. So what should our athletes remember about the GLP-1 agonist from your perspective?
You know what? Do not take them. It is not worthy. Especially this message goes to our athletes that are women. So do not take these substances. I know that it can be quite tempting because it is trendy and you're watching your weight and so on. But in women, a certain syndrome can actually occur in quite more frequently than in men, and that is relative energy deficiency syndrome, and it is there even without taking GLP agonists. And the symptoms, or what you can see, is that you are not eating enough calories, you are burning a lot of them because you are doing your sport, and then at some point your menstruation starts to have some problems. You cannot have your menstrual bleeding, and then that's quite a good indication that something is not good, that you're not eating enough calories. And what it can lead to is osteoporosis, because if you're not eating enough calories, you're not eating enough calcium, and certain symptoms can occur, your performance will decrease, and so on and so on. So GLP-1 agonist, not for the athletes, and especially not for women.
So to sum up, I would say that with GLP-1 agonists, you're going to have a lot of problems.
Yeah, more problems than benefits, so stay away from them.
Thank you very much, Christian, for this first episode, and we are looking forward to our next episode.
See you.
See you later. Bye.